Hello everybody, welcome to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. Today I do not want to mince words, we are going right into it. The top 10 most impactful cards printed in the year 2020 for cEDH. Let's check them out. Alright, we're going to start this video off with an honorable mention, Zirda the Dawnwaker. Now Zirda is one that I wanted to throw in here because it's had a huge impact for me as a cEDH player, but maybe not the community as a whole. You see, Zirda was the card that allowed me to spawn the Dawnwaker Thrasios archetype out of the old evolution decks, and it really has been a huge part of me as a deck builder. It was my first primer that I really devoted my full time and energy into, and the deck has evolved into many different forms from where it started. But it was all because of my interest in the fact that Zirda plus a monolith just win infinite, and Zirda being an amazing value engine on top of that really helped to solidify that as one of the most impactful cards for me personally in the year 2020. Number 10 on my list is not the sexiest card, but it is one of the most important cards to have come out this year, and that's Miscast. Now, Miscast is just a role filler. It is a good counterspell that really works in the more proactive decks in our formats. It's one of the few cards on our list from M21, but it's not very often that we get a counterspell that fits right into the competitive EDH format, and I think Miscast is a great addition to the format. It's a good counterspell. It's nice to have good 1 mana interaction. It's better than Spell Pierce at times, worse than Spell Pierce at other times, but either way, in the more proactive decks in our format, in the Turbo Ad Nauseam archetype, it tends to be played quite a lot, and a lot of these proactive decks are slotting in Miscast, which is why it makes our number 10 spot. Number 9 is Peer into the Abyss. When this card first came out, there was a lot of talk. Is the 7 mana on this spell too much? Is the fact that it's a sorcery too much? And the answer ended up being no. Peer into the Abyss is a staple in any Turbo Ad Nauseam strategy in cEDH, and it's here to stay. It's a very powerful card. It takes a bit to ramp up to, but when it resolves, it wins games. Now this next card, some people may argue, is higher on this list, but I have it low because of the fact that it has not yet made a huge impact on our format. A lot of that is because the Turbo Ad Nauseam archetypes are taking over, and they are not ones to play this card a ton, but I have seen it in some of those lists as well, and I'm talking about Jeweled Lotus. Despite Jeweled Lotus being a very impactful card, despite the conversations around it being very hyperbolic, it still had an impact on our format. The discussions around it had an impact on our format, and the idea that commander-centric decks are finally getting a boost from WotC as opposed to a kick in the shins like other cards we're going to talk about later. It's really nice to see that Jeweled Lotus exists. It's a good thing for our format in general, and despite it not yet showing up in the top tables, well, we haven't had a tournament since it's been printed, so we shall see how Jeweled Lotus becomes a part of our format and whether it will end up giving the commander-centric decks a boon that they require, or whether it will just be a piece that exists for decks that need it. If we are talking about sheer impact on what the definition of cEDH is, I cannot have this list without talking about my baby, Winoda. Many of you may be saying, well, Winoda's not shaping the format, Winoda's not the centerpiece of the format right now, but it was the first Boros deck to be put on the competitive EDH database. Ever. In the history of the database, it is the first one, and that's something. Now, I'm not sitting here claiming that Winoda is by far like the best deck in the format or anything even close to that, but it is the only Boros option that exists right now. It was the first Boros option to exist in the format, and it's really exciting that this is now an option for people to play who've always enjoyed the color combination, who want to play a deck that relies around creatures. I mean, we're playing cards like Goblin Rabblemaster in the deck. It is something unique, it is something exciting, and it definitely deserves to make the top 10 as far as impact on the format. As far as changing notions of what can and cannot exist in our format, it has made an impact and therefore is on this list. The next card that is going to be shown on this list also kind of cascades on that notion, and I'm talking about Heliod the Sun Crowned. Despite the fact that Heliod is something quite unique and a bit of an enigma in the format, the things that Heliod's printing has been able to do for our format are actually really unique and really interesting. Before Heliod was put on the database, there was no mono-white options that existed as far as competitive EDH. Now, people argue that Teshar was an option and has been for a bit of time, but to be fair, it was not on the database before Heliod. Heliod was the first to make a tournament impact and be recognized. Now, due to the fact of the work that Michael Levine and many others have put into Heliod, and Michael Levine's specific performance through multiple tournaments this year have made mono white a viable option in cEDH, which is something other people would have scoffed at. And because of that performance, because of the fact that there are people putting in so much work on a nearly professional level for the cEDH archetype, it has made mono white playable. It has changed the fact that mono white is now a viable option, and it has allowed people to look at the format in different ways. People are judging stacks in a way that they haven't judged it before, and in a way that's a lot more enlightened than old ideas about what cEDH necessarily is or was. The idea that now rule of laws are significantly more playable now that Flash is out of our format has also shaped that archetype as well. So Heliod, being responsible for a lot of forward progression in thinking, had to be added to this top 10. Interrupting you halfway through the top 10 list to remind you, while you're here on YouTube, go check out our like and subscribe buttons down below. And if you're interested in supporting content like this, check us out on Comedian MTG at patreon.com. Now, the next pair is, like I said, a pair because there are a few cards on here that basically go together, and these are two Flash 3-drops that have been recently added to the format in Commander Legends. I am speaking, of course, of Hull Breacher and Opposition Agent. Now, each of them has derived different conversations in our format. Opposition Agent has been the focus of a lot more hyperbole, but as the format has adjusted to these new cards, I'm actually noticing a lot of the more aggressive archetypes moving towards Hull Breacher instead of Opposition Agent, which is something to note if you're moving forward in the format right now. The sort of gut reaction that people had to Opposition Agent's printing has been pretty big. People are asking if they should be running fetch lands in their decks, and monocolored decks aside, it's kind of an aggressive sentiment to be talking about in these archetypes, the fact that people are questioning fetch lands. Now, obviously that's a bit of an extreme reaction, and a lot of the most avid players of cEDH would tell you that's kind of ridiculous. But the fact that that is a reaction due to this card has shown you the impact of it on our format. A lot of tutors are the reasons we are able to have consistency in these 100 card piles. So the fact that Opposition Agent is now a direct attack on that, the fact that it can be Dark Ritualed out as early as turn 1. For a while there, it was really only Aven Mindcensor that made people have that sort of mentality, but now Opposition Agent is doing the exact same thing, and decks that can play both are pretty scary when it comes to trying to tutor against them. As far as Hull Breacher, people are now scared on turn 3 instead of turn 4 about Notion Wheel effects. The fact that Hull Breacher is basically a stacks piece against Mystic Remora and Rhystic Study is hugely impactful. These two 3-drops kind of fill the same space. They both come in, both Commander Legends cards, both Flash 3-drops that have decent bodies. They're both very impactful cards, and they affected the format, and they are now putting the format on a strange axis where everyone's now kind of inclined to push more removal in their decks to answer these threats, because certain decks cannot allow these cards to stay on the battlefield and try and win. Now, speaking of cards that had people freaking the hell out, we're going to talk about Drannith Magistrate. Despite what Drannith Magistrate is now, and despite what it has been over the past few months, you cannot argue that a card has had as much impact as Drannith Magistrate in conversation. Drannith Magistrate's printing was something of a derisive topic. People were convinced that the card was going to break the format, convinced that it was going to stop certain decks from being playable. It was a huge deal. I know many decks I was on that are commander focused were like, can we even play anymore? What options do we need to be able to play our decks if this card exists? And of course, decks that were already relying on partner pairs with commander agnostic win cons obviously got a huge boon from this card's printing. The initial hyperbole and hype about this card definitely made it out to be something bigger than it was going to be in general. However, it is hard to argue that the card is not extremely impactful. Now we are getting up to our top 3. This is another pair that I'm going to talk about right now, and that is Deflecting, Swat, and Fierce Guardianship. And if we think about this format right now and the way that our format is shaped, a lot of it is with the addition of 2 free counterspells to our format. The fact that we not only have Force of Will now, Pact of Negation, Force of Negation, but now we have 2 more on top of that. One that encourage you to play your commanders and encourage early commanders. A part of this conversation is definitely the existence of Thrasios and Rograk, as they are 2 of the earliest competitive commanders to get down on the battlefield. They are definitely two that really gain an advantage from being able to play these cards. But Fierce Guardianship and Deflecting Swat are both extremely impactful cards. They fill the same space and therefore definitely deserve to be on the same number here. The idea that there is just that much more free interaction in our format makes the format way more interesting, and it makes it so that you have to really read your opponents. Being able to say, oh, well, they don't have any mana up is kind of a non-factor in this format anymore because of all the free interaction in it. It's hard to argue that their existence did not shape this format. Number 2 and number 1 are definitely able to have a conversation about which one's interchangeable, but I'm pretty confident in the fact that number 2 is Underworld Breach. Underworld Breach has become one of the premier archetypes in our format. The fact that most competitive decks nowadays are at least touching this shows you just how strong it is. It is the perfect pair with ad nauseum strategies. It is amazing with intuition piles, with Savine's Reclamation, with a ton of other cards that really show that Breach is thriving in our format. It has become one of the best win conditions. It is a compact pile. It allows for a lot of late game. It allows for storming to be a valid strategy. I remember at the beginning of the year, I was one of the few people playing Brain Freeze in my Underworld Breach decks, and I had people telling me all the time that I was playing this awful dead card in my deck, and I was like, I hate to tell you guys, but wait until you play it with Breach. And then it started to become a thing, and now it is like doctrine. It is the only way to play these cards is with Breach and LED and Brain Freeze, and yet other decks are playing it when they don't have access to blue. They're playing things like Wheels and Smothering Tithe to get advantage off of that, and Breach is just so strong. It gets you so much value, and it's 2 mana, a 2 mana enchantment that can be broken in like 13 different ways. It is so remarkably impactful, and it has shaped the competitive EDH format. The most impactful card of 2020 is pretty obviously Thassa's Oracle. Now, whether the impact on this format from Thassa's Oracle is positive or negative, that is up for debate. Thassa's Oracle has definitely been a strong addition to our format, and strength has come with a lot of pain. The Flash winter we faced right before the Flash ban was a tough time for the competitive format. It is hard to argue that a card has had more impact than Thassa's Oracle. It got a card banned for competitive EDH, which is something that has never happened before in the history of Commander. Thassa's Oracle was the card that pushed Flash over the edge as far as competitive playable, and it is the card that made a ban happen for competitive EDH. The card is so efficient. It allows for very clean wins with Demonic Consultation and Tainted Pact lines. It allows for decks like Hermit Druid decks to have a very clean outlet. No longer do you have to worry about your Laboratory Maniac or Jace Wooler Mystery getting removed with the trigger on the stack. It basically says you need stack interaction or you're going to lose the game. And that's a pretty intense pressure to put on the table. It has made blue-black basically the best colors in the format, despite the fact that they were probably already there to begin with red now being added to the conversation, obviously. Thassa's Oracle is game-breaking in many ways, but by far, as far as cards printed in 2020, it is the most impactful. Thank you for watching this top 10. I hope you guys liked it. Remember to like and subscribe while you're here on YouTube, and I hope you guys have an amazing week. Bye.